Okay, so we're going to continue along the same lines of the sugya that we talked about last week, and the subject was the question of whether if you make a promise that is not really sincere, it's called patume milsa ba'alma. It's just puffery. You're saying something sometimes to mollify somebody or to encourage them, but it's not real. It's not really meant to be a real statement from which you can be held liable. So that was the subject, and we had several examples of that. And now the Gemara today on Samach Vav Amud Aleph is going to pick up on that. It's about halfway maybe through, a little bit less than halfway through the blot on Amud Aleph, and it starts with Ahu Shchiv Mera. Ahu Shchiv Mera. That's the last words of maybe what 10 lines down or so.
Hmm.
Yeah. So Shchiv Mera is a term for someone who is really lying on his deathbed. In other words, he's in the throes of death, or you can see that death will overtake him shortly. So the Gemara in many places talks about Shchiv Mara and the comments of the person who is lying ill as to what his intentions are, because at that point in time we say that there's no sidebar. It is what it is. So we look at it a little bit more strictly because the Shriv Mara is not sort of puffing. He's not saying something to mollify. He's really being very direct. So the Gemara says, "Ahu Shriv Mara," a person who was a Shriv Mara, and the Batala Gita L'Ravusa. Now we know certainly in olden times and maybe even today, that Gittin were written by men who went off to war. So they went off to war and they gave their wife a get. Now, there was two ways of giving the get. One was an outright get, so she was a grusha, she was divorced the moment she got the get, even before he went to war. But then there was a get al tanai that if he doesn't come back from war, then she's a grusha. But you sort of have to articulate what you're doing when you do it. So here, the Shriv Mara, he did this, but he did it for a particular reason. He did it because he didn't want her to go through Yibum. In other words, they had no children, and so normally she would be tied to a levirate marriage where she would have to marry the husband's brother, the Hakim Shmo Yisrael, and it's a process. I mean, some people it's more it's a struggle. It's more demeaning. I mean, it is a process, obviously, and so he wanted her to avoid Yibum. But if he gives her a get and he dies, there's no Yibum because Yibum was only when he dies married to her and they're childless. So that was the intent. The intent was to get around Yibum. So he gave her a get, Ingid v'asna. Now, when he gave the get, the Gemara says that he sighed, he was unhappy, he may have let out a groan. In other words, he didn't do it wholeheartedly to say, I'm embracing this with all my might. He did it kind of almost reluctantly. In other words, he didn't want to divorce her, but he wanted to make it easy for her, so he did that. So he groaned. Armalea Maiko Mizchant. So his wife asked him, why are you sighing? Why are you doing this? So he says, Ikaima didachana. So now she's saying to him, if you remain alive and you overcome this illness that you're on your deathbed, then I'm married to you. In other words, she wanted to mollify him by telling him that don't worry about it. You want to give me a get, but don't worry about it because I'm here for you. And if something happens, then okay. But if nothing, I'm here. So we have an interesting situation where he makes a pronouncement to actually give her the get to prevent Yibum, and he's not happy with it. And she says, "Don't worry about it," which is similar to what we've been talking about when pituma milsa ba'alma, when you just make random statements that may not have real kiyum, they don't have real sustainability, but you make them. So again, we had this discussion last week about a maimer who coins this term of pituma milsa. So and he holds that pituma milsa does not bind. So what do we do here? What's the situation here? So the Gemara wants to parallel this case with those cases. So here in the case of Shriv Mara, um, so she says, "Ikayam didachano Omarav Zvid." So this is the circumstance, um, and he gave her the get. He gave her the get, and this was the circumstance. Omarav Zvid says Rav Zvid, "Petuma mila ba'almahu." That when she said, um, "Don't worry, I'm here for you," those were Petum and Mila. In other words, he was giving her a divorce. She wanted to soften the impact by saying, "Don't worry, I'm here." And Rav Zvid says that her words don't have any real conviction because they're just Petum and Mila. They're just, words of comfort or, sort of vagary, but the words of comfort. And therefore, he can't hold her to the get. So she really is divorced because he gave her the get. She wanted to soften the impact and said, "Don't worry about it." Says Rav Zvid, you can't do that. And now, especially you have to realize by Gittin, we're much more sensitive, as we said many times in the Gemara, because you have all kinds of ramifications if a get is not proper and there's a remarriage. So we have a lot of issues. So we're much more makbid by Gittin than we might be otherwise.
But doesn't she have to accept the get,
You
even
have,
in those days?
yeah,
Her comment shows there's no words that she accepts the get in this situation.
right. So here's the thing. In those days, a get was given even if the wife didn't want to accept it. Later on, it became a different situation with Rabbeinu Gershom, and he said no, she has to be makabel, and that's a separate question. But certainly in the time of the Gemara, he could give the get, and she's divorced. I mean, she doesn't have a say in the matter, so to speak, is that she can object to receiving the get. So what she's saying is, in effect, don't worry about the get because I'll remain your wife. Says Rav Zvid, no, it doesn't work that way. He gave her a get. She can't undo the get merely by giving him words of comfort, Petuma Milza. So therefore, Rav Zvid said that if she wants to remarry, she can remarry. She can marry elsewhere because she really is divorced. And again, remember that Mila de Gittin are very sensitive. So if Rav Zvid's saying that, he's not playing around because you have, if she has a child or whatever the case may be. So why says Rav Zvid, Petum Mila de Almahu, because her words are not, they're just words, and therefore you can't hold her to it. Okay, so remember that here he gave the get outright. He could have given her a conditional get, right, which was an alternative, and he didn't. Why we don't know. Gemara doesn't say why he didn't want to do a conditional get. He gave a get outright, and she responded, "Don't worry." So in those circumstances, Rav Zid said, it doesn't hold. You can't hold her to it. She is she can marry. Now she can marry even if he doesn't die. In other words, let's say he's a shchiv mara and miraculously he doesn't die. So l'chayre he would want to stay with her, but he's already divorced her, and it's a finite divorce, not a conditional divorce. So this is an example supporting a maimer where Rav Zvid says that betume mila ba'almahu, that they're just words. So this is something we have to really understand. Um, so to understand how deep this goes. Okay, so that's Rav Zvid. Now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, is that really the case?
That
Um,
doesn't sound right.
right? And there seems to be something here that,
You missed.
might not be 100% kosher because under these circumstances, again, maybe we should be more machmir and say that she's not divorced. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen, he'll give her another get or, a get later so that the get will actually be without ambiguity. Because here there's some ambiguity, at least in the sense that what she said, she said. Now, the deeper understanding of this Gemara is what you just asked, Jay, is that the wife does not have really a say on the get. It's not as if she can make conditions on the get. If he makes conditions on the get and we look at the conditions and we say no, these conditions don't work, okay, because he's the giver of the get and it has to be tried and true. And if you make certain conditions, it doesn't work. But for her to say, I'm making conditions on the get, that was not part of the plan. That wasn't what the whole Indian of Gittin is. So again, it gives rise to some concern, different than in a monetary case where what's the worst that would happen, right? We would have sort of monetary issues which we have to go through. But by Yuchsin, by Gittin, it's a much more serious circumstance. Um, so, so here's the kasha. Amalei Rav Acha Medifta Ravina. Rav Acha Medifta asked Ravina, "V'i lav petum mila mai." Um, what would be? It's sort of a hypothetical. If what would be the thinking here if this pitum mila, if these words of comfort didn't apply? Okay, let's say hypothetically. Okay, you're saying that it applies, therefore she can go ahead and marry. What happens if it doesn't apply? In other words, you throw it out and you say, no, it doesn't resonate. Um, then the question is she tied to her husband?
Yeah. Mm.
So let's think it out loud. So she's not tied because we say Petuma Mila, but let's say Petuma Mila was not a thing. It was not a solid reasoning that would she in fact be tied to the husband? Bidido kaima the mishra hana begita. In other words, this is the question. Does she have a role in the get where she can say something that upends the get? Remember, we're saying that the get is strictly one-sided. The husband gives the get as long as it's a kosher get. She can't object. It seems to be that she's inserting herself in the process and changing the course of the get. And that's not in the plan. Right? In the time of the Gemara, that was not the understanding that a wife has the ability to change the course of the get. But yet that would be the case here. Because in this particular case, we would say that whatever she said doesn't matter, and she is, in other words, no, the other way around. We're saying that what she says, Petuma Mila would be binding, meaning that she can upend the get by saying, "Don't worry, I'll be there." And and again, the halacha there was that she has no role in the get. So this is really a kasha on the understanding of Petuma Mila, especially by Shchiv Mara, of understanding of because by Shchiv Mara, remember we have different rules in the laws of divorce. It's not the same as the monetary laws. So you want to say that Petuma Mila is just a throwaway. It's not a throwaway. If she means it seriously, but can you really mean it seriously where she is going to intervene in the process, which is not the halacha? It's not the halacha that she can intervene in the process. So this is sort of the Gemara's kasha here, is how to understand the process of Petuma Mila, specifically when it applies to a gittin. Again, this is, was solely focused on Gittin because of the seriousness of what's going on. So that's the Gemara's kasha. So how do we understand it? Because Ravid is saying that Petumimila, and if you're going to say Petumimila, then she's intervening in the get, and that she can't do. So that's the kasha that the Gemara is asking on Rav Zvid on his interpretation. So again, so to understand, it's different than in monetary matters where we don't have this halacha of a woman can't intervene in a man or woman, but a woman can't intervene in monetary matters. There's no such thing. So if you take this case and put it on a monetary scale, then her words may have more effect because she's allowed to speak. She can say what she wants to say. But here in this particular case, it's much more sensitive. Can you really say that? And so that's the kasha. That's the kasha. So now the Gemara wants to give a following answer. Ma'u de tema. You would have thought that what she said is binding, meaning that that the get is a good get, right? Hahugufe adata dido ko gomer v'yorv gita. Why? Remember, there was one other factor in this fact pattern that we have to bring out. He gave the get, and then he sighed. What was the meaning of the sigh? That means his kavana was really not to give the get, or he was reluctant to give the get. So it's not just the case where he gives the get and then she has to accept it. So because so you might think that because this is not the normal circumstance of giving a get where the wife has to accept the get because he himself was kind of hesitant to give the get, so maybe there is no get. The fact that she says, I'm here with you, may not be a factor because his reluctance, he has to have the kavana, and his reluctance may in fact make the get not a binding get. Komash Malon. So now Rav Zvid tells us, no, that notwithstanding his sort of reluctance or the shakiness of his statement, you can't hold her to a binding statement, and therefore she is free to marry. So, in other words, what we're saying is these facts aren't quite the same facts that we had, let's say, in the case of a monetary situation. If we did, we might have a different outcome. But here, the Gemara wants to tell us that even in the case where the husband has a reluctance, and you might say, okay, he has a reluctance, she says, don't worry about it. Maybe those two factors together can undo the get. Says Rav Zvid, Kamash Malan, no, that it does not have an effect, because what she said doesn't really have any reglaim. It has no substance. So therefore, the get is a good get, and she can remarry. And again,
Suppose she said some real words.
said again.
Suppose she says a little bit more than I'll be here. He says, look, you don't really want to divorce me, so let's forget about it.
Yeah, but remember that you're facing the question of from Al Pi Halacha, she can't control.
Yeah, but the fact that we analyze and we discuss her statements and her behavior and her body language, whatever, that obviously it's important enough, which I'm questioning. Suppose she said a couple of more words. Ah, you don't mean it, this and that, so don't worry about it. I know you don't mean it.
Right.
So
So
Rabbi,
yeah,
just to clarify, I mean, this, because the halacha, and I want to hear how that would pertain to today.
yeah,
But the halacha is if he gives the get, nothing not his emotions, not his sighing, not her saying anything. It's all irrelevant. So why bring this up? Because the law of the get is that if he bestows the get for whatever reason, it's a good get, no matter any protestations from her or any, you know, reaction which we were subject to interpretation. He gives a get, it's a get. Now, would that be different today?
Well, so it's a little complicated because in the Middle Ages, Rabbeinu Gershom made several pronouncements. Of course, we know several pronouncements about marriage and other things. And one of the pronouncements that he made is that you cannot give a get to a woman against her will. In other words, she has to be a party to the get and she can't object. So, al pi halacha today, um, although I haven't been involved in too many gittin, if a woman fiercely objects to the receipt of the get, I think we have a problem. Is that we have to sort of figure out how how the parties can agree that the get should be chal because she may just be, I don't know, malicious or otherwise. She may say, "I'm not accepting the get." Now, there is a halacha though that if a person sends a shaliach to give a get, and the shaliach can't sort of really connect or contact the wife, but he knows where she lives. So he goes to her house, he knocks on the door, she doesn't answer, and he leaves the get on the doorstep. So there, that's considered constructive receipt. And so the get would be a good get. But this question of voluntary acceptance, that's what poses the problem. So I think the answer, Michael, today is we have to sort of work around her reluctance. I don't know how many women would be reluctant to receive a get because she gets, I mean, she gets what she needs to get. If there's a real serious situation, or children or other things, then for the most part, I don't know too. Again, just anecdotally, the problem usually is in the husband giving the get rather than the wife receiving
That's
it.
the irony, Rabbi.
That's the irony.
We
Right,
have two different rules. It's
right, exactly. And again, you would say, oh, how could the Torah do that? The Torah says, Ki yikach ish isha. I mean, the Torah makes it clear that the husband is the one who controls both the marriage coming in and the getting going out. Fair, unfair, I
but
don't think
but Rabbi, if she doesn't accept the marriage, he can't marry her. So
that's
he
correct.
does have the right
She does have
to
the right
refuse
exactly
the
right.
marriage, but not
But not,
technically
yeah,
not the get, even
yeah,
though, but now we're saying, so if she ends up moving and she's selling the house and it's her address and they leave it's a constructive get, but she's not there and to receive it, she has escaped getting the get. I mean,
that's correct. And that becomes very problematic. I'm saying again, because in
but
Gittin, you have to be 110% sure that it's done properly. Otherwise, we have a real problem. So to your point, you're right, is that the again, if he gives it or the shaliach gives it, they have to be made. They have to testify that she was there. He saw her there. No question that it is hers. And he left the get because she wouldn't open the door. But he can't just say, "Oh, I left the get," because you're right. Maybe she moved. Maybe it's not her house. Maybe she's in the process of selling it and he doesn't know it. So he can't. You can't rely on that. There has to be visual sort of evidence that she's receiving the get. Also, there's cases in the Gemara where she's standing and talking to somebody, and you throw the get next to her. In other words, in her Dalet Amos, even though she doesn't receive it, but it's clear that it's in her ambit. Our Dalet Amos is in her in her sviva. So when you do that, that's also considered constructive receipt. But again, these are all kinds of issues. You're correct. These are all kinds of issues. So the chiddush here that the fact that he introduced this sort of reluctance. He groaned, he sighed, whatever it was. That would be a Havamina to say maybe all bets are off and this should not be considered the norm. So Kamash Malon, the Gemara is saying no, that she is just mollifying him, um, and you can't hold her to it, and therefore they're divorced. So now there's an interesting discussion also among the Rishonim. What was his mindset? In other words, we're very concerned about the wife's mindset. What was she thinking when she said it? Did he believe he's lying on his deathbed and he hears her saying, "Don't worry"? Does he believe it? Or does he not believe it? In other words, is his kavana that, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is not what, this isn't the real get, or because she doesn't want to accept, she wants to be here, and I'm more than happy not to give the get. If I die, I die, but if not, then we're married. So the kasha that is asked is, what about his mindset? Does his mindset play a role in all of this? So again, it's a discussion of the Rishonim, and many say that when he gives the get, he's not relying on anything she says. In other words, he's giving it, and it's straightforward. And if she makes comments like these Petuma Milza, it doesn't resonate with him. In other words, it doesn't register that she's saying it. But that's a discussion as to whether or not his mindset has changed because he sees that she really doesn't want to accept the get. I mean, he's doing it for her benefit, really, because he says, "I don't want you to go through Yibum," or whatever the case may be. But whether or not he really means it or not is an outright question. So many of them say, yeah, he means it because it's not a condition that he accepts that she may not want the get. So the fact that she said it, she said it. But his mind is he gives her the get for her benefit. He doesn't want to hear her say, "Oh, don't worry, I'll be here for you." So, but that's a separate question. I just raise it because we don't talk about his mindset. We're only talking about what she says, and the halacha is that she doesn't have a role. So it's really what he says, and he's giving the get. Now, if you have all the outward manifestations of giving a get, and in your inside, in your brain, you have a different thought, we can't read your mind. We don't know, you're giving the get, you're giving it voluntarily. We're not going to, second guess and say, oh, no, he really didn't mean to give the get. He gave the get. He gave the get because he wanted to release her from Yibum. So in any event, we're drawing some parallels and discussion about the case of a Shchiv Mara to our situation, but in the end, Rav Zvid really is holding like a maimer that whatever she says is not, it doesn't hold her to it because she's just giving him words of comfort.
On the issue of what's in his mind, if he were a Kohen, he would have a lot more concern than if he weren't, because he could always remarry the
exactly. But I think that's where the discussion of the Rishonim is that what's the chazaka? Is the chazaka that when he gives it, his mindset is I'm giving it, or is there a chazaka that he's giving it, but there's a reluctance in giving it? And there's a danger there, because if you want to interpret reluctance and other things, you're absolutely right, David. Then it becomes a question of more than just gittin, becomes, gerushin and other things. So I think that generally speaking, the accepted practice is that we don't go behind what he does. We're not looking into his machshava. What does he really mean? Unless he actually extrapolates and says in so many words, this is what I'm thinking, we accept his actions and we say his actions are pure. He wants to give the get. And the fact that she says something to mollify him does not really affect his thinking. So, because again, we should not know it, but when a person is a Shchiv Mara, what's a Shchiv Mara's mindset? I mean, he knows he's on his deathbed. He wants to be emes, right? Usually, a person wants to um, confess his sins and be straightforward. So,
Tidy up the details.
what's that?
He wants to tidy up all the details.
Already, right, right. So that's a separate but interesting discussion. Is that the halacha really is that you don't throw in all these extraneous factors. It says, oh, maybe he didn't mean it, this, that, and the other. All that's doing is creating ambiguity. And we're saying, no, we're going to follow the trail. He made the pronouncement. It's a get. Now, if he recovers, then he recovers. Then, I mean, he can always, but you're saying, David, if he's a Kohen and he divorces
Marry.
her and then he recovers, can he remarry her?
Can, right?
Right. That's the question because the get would have been a good get. So, which is why
And yeah, then you have to know what now you know what the krechts is about.
that what the crack was exactly. But here's the interesting point here is that that's why Gittin al Tanai are acceptable because we didn't want to run into that problem, especially in wartime or otherwise. We didn't want to run into the problem where you gave a get and now she's a grusha and what the ramifications of her being a grusha are. So we had this get al Tanai. Now I'm pretty sure that in Eretz Yisrael, where unfortunately with wars and people going to war, this becomes a real question, and I don't know the answer as to how the rabbinate as a whole determines it because I've not heard that there is widespread gittin before a war. I've not heard that, especially now in these last couple of years. There's nothing to suggest that all of the soldiers who went to the front and were married gave conditional gittin. I don't know the answer, but I would be hard pressed to think that that was the case. So in any event.
It would be if there were more Haredim in the army.
More Haredi in the army, right? So we would have to change the laws, but look, it's a fascinating discussion because look at all the ramifications in Gittin as to whether or not, again, in the case of a business dealing, it's pretty straightforward. There's not all the complications. When you're talking about Yuchsin and Gittin, and this becomes a much more complicated area. All right, so we see that Rav Zvid really supports the position of Amemar that Petuma Milsa is accepted. That she says it, but it's not binding because it was not meant with the sincerity that you would not accept. And again, the problem is that she can't, if he's giving it, she can't say something to soften the blow so there shouldn't be a get because that's against the halacha. She can't be the one to dictate. So you run into that situation, which you don't run into in business because she can say whatever, she has an opinion. But in the case of a get, she doesn't really have a say. So shall we say Petuma Milsa? Okay. So that ends that sugya. And we see that Petuma Milsa is a thing. And we said the halacha is that whatever she says is just words, and the get in this particular case would hold through. Okay, now we're going to turn now to the next part of the Mishnah. If you remember, at the end of the Mishnah, we had a circumstance where, say, Reuven lent Shimon $100. Shimon gave him a field as a collateral. And he said, if I don't pay you within 3 years, Shalosh Shanim, field is yours. So now you already start seeing the outlines of a question. What's he really saying? Does he mean it? Does he not mean it? In other words, are they Petuma Milsa? We're not using that term here, but when he makes that kind of gesture, what's he really saying? Especially if the collateral is much more than the loan. If it's equivalent to the loan, okay, it's a different circumstance. But for a $100 loan, he gives him a field worth $1,000. There's an imbalance here. So the Gemara wants to sort of flesh that out a little bit in line with what we're saying. Here's the situation. Havola Sadehu. So in other words, the case we had where in the Mishnah where I lent you money with the field as a collateral, and you say that if I don't pay you, it's yours. Omer Rav Huna. So what's really happening here? It's a conditional loan, and the condition will sort of not up front. The condition will show itself at the end of the term, okay? Because certainly at the beginning of the term, there's nothing wrong with giving a field as a collateral, maybe regardless of its price. So here comes an interesting machlokes. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, "B'shas matan mos." Now this is very important. If in the time that he gives him the money for the loan, I give you $100. At the time of the loan, uh, then I give you the collateral. Simultaneous to the loan, says Rav Huna, Kona Hakol. Then, if later the borrower defaults and says, I can't pay, says Rav Huna, the lender has acquired the entire field because it was given sort of even Steven as the collateral in real time for the loan. So that's Rav Huna's thinking here. Now, the fact that there's an imbalance in the price doesn't matter. We'll see in a minute why. La'acher matan mos, if they made the deal, lent him the $100. There was no collateral exchanged at the time that the loan was made. And after the fact, he says, oh, by the way, I have a field here. I'm going to let you hold the field as collateral. Says the Gemara, lo kona ela keneged ma'osav. And we had this discussion the other week, is in terms of discussing the Mishnah, that he's only entitled to the value of the property corresponding to his loan. So if the loan was $100, the property was $1,000, he's entitled to $100. And now, so the question is how he gets it. Can he sell off the field and take off the money? But that's really not the point. The point is that he doesn't get the whole thing because it's not valid. Now, so what are we talking about here? What is the underlying proposition? So there is a concept in the Gemara, we may have come across it before. It's called asmachta. What is an asmachta? An asmachta is, I say something to you, I may not mean it, but I say it because I want you to feel comfortable with, let's say, in the case of a loan, that I'm reliable. So what will I say to you? David, I have a property, no problem. If I can't pay you, it's yours. He doesn't mean it. He knows the property is worth 10 times the loan, but it's an asmachta because he wants to give comfort to the lender that he's real, and that he'll say, "Of course, I'll give you the money." I mean, look at what look at my collateral. I don't know if it's the same as in a pawnbroker. You go to a pawnbroker and you borrow $100 and you give him a diamond. Now, the diamond may be worth a lot more than $100, of course, but why would the pawnbroker lend you the money? He lends you the money because it's an asmachta that you're sincere. Why? Because I gave you a diamond ring. So asmachta, in a sense, not the same, but it's the petuma milsa. It's like I'm giving you something. I don't mean it, but I'm giving you something to induce you. Now, in the case of petuma milsa, it's not necessarily an inducement. I'm just drawing the parallel that these are words that are meant to be relied upon for the loan, but not relied upon for the statement for which it's made, meaning you can keep the field. So Rav Huna wants to say, when it's an asmachta? Only when it isn't done at the time, in real time, at the time of the loan. Then I agree with you, it's an asmachta. But if I lend you money and in real time you give me the field, then, says Rav Huna, it's not an asmachta. It was meant as an exchange that I will pledge to you a field of $1,000 for now lending me $100.
But,
So Rav Huna is
but
now making a distinction on the concept of a smachta, because a smachta really is it's a very widespread halacha in the Torah, and we see it in many cases. Is that it's kind of like the statement, you can't mean it, right? You can't mean that you're going to give me a land for $1,000 for $100 loan. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, Michael.
Rabbi, it doesn't make sense here because you know that the field is worth a lot more than the loan. So if you give the asmachta up front, so he'll make the loan as opposed to giving it later to ensure that, I'm still going to pay you. I don't understand the difference between when it occurs. Everyone knows it's a security for the loan, but not necessarily equivalent. And if the person who is lending the money ends up taking that property, which is worth a lot more, that's ribis. He's getting more value for it than its actual value is. So the conclusion from Rav Huna that immediately it's an exchange at that point if you don't get it that's a false. I mean, nobody would believe that it would be dollar for dollar in that case if it was worth 10 times as much.
So it's a good question. So let me first say that the parties had an opportunity at the outset for the borrower to say to the lender, I don't have collateral for $100. I have collateral for $1,000, and I'm pledging that collateral, but only to the tune of $100. In other words, they didn't say anything here, Michael. This was all silent. So we say if it's silent, then that's what he must have meant. He could have articulated and said, "I'm not giving you a $1,000 field for $100," and the lender would have said, "Okay, I understand that because I'm still covered because you have an expensive land, and if you have to sell it, I'll get my $100." But the fact that there was silence here, that there was no discussion, that gives rise to the concern that he may have, at the time, felt that the only way he's going to get that loan, which he desperately needs, is by pledging a field of
Yes,
$1,000.
but he's still only entitled to the value equivalent to the loan.
But
If
it's not
you
ribis. Let me tell you why it's not ribis. Because ribis is when there is an unintended benefit of a transaction that you and I make, especially ribis deraisa, where in a loan, and I'm going to benefit from that more than I would have agreed to. When you agree to make this imbalanced deal, the deal is upfront. There's no question that, oh, I'm going to get a windfall later. No, two parties can agree on a bad deal. You want to prevent someone from making a bad deal, Michael. You can't prevent two people
But
from making a
if he
bad
didn't
deal.
say anything before and he didn't say anything later and he wasn't asked for the collateral and he decided to provide it at either time, what difference does it make when he does it? Why do you conclude at the beginning that it's an absolute exchange if I don't pay the loan back? In essence, you're saying at that time you're going to get a 10 times benefit for a loan, which means you're making money on the loan, which to me is ribis. You're charging him extra if he can't pay for it, as opposed to saying that at the beginning or in the middle, you get your portion of the land that is equivalent to the amount of the loan, but no more or no less.
Well, sort of a related question would be, could he then force a sale? This land is worth 10 times the loan. Would it then, if it isn't able to pay the loan, wouldn't the logical thing be that the land would get sold and then a portion, whatever appropriate portion, without any interest, would get used to pay off the loan, rather than just that the guy would have the entire land in perpetuity?
Yeah. So in essence, that's what would happen, is that he's entitled to his money. The time has come to his money, and so you have to pay me. So the borrower is now forced to sell the field. but he can still make a condition with the lender that if I get the money, I'll get the field back. In other words, he can still make that condition, and maybe the lender will be open to that because as long as he doesn't get rivets there, he'll be open to that because all he wants is his money back. He's an Elicha guy. He says, I lent you $100. I want $100 back. You can't give it to me. Sell the field. But so in other words, that becomes a question of the sincerity of the parties, and there would be no reason to think that the lender wouldn't give him back the land. Um, Maybe the lender is the one who's cashing out the land. In other words, the land is worth $1,000. The borrower doesn't have it. The lender has it. So he'll pay him out the $1,000, take back 100, and this guy will have $900 worth of less than his $1,000 value. But he'll say to him, if I get another $100, I want my land. I want to come back and get my land back. So
But that's not the first case. The first case is at the beginning, he loses the entire amount of land.
Michael, because you can make a bad deal. You can enter into a bad deal that is not in your interest because you're saying, I need this money desperately, and the only reason you're going to lend it to me is because I show you my sincerity.
But you're saying the same thing in the interim where he's posting the collateral later. It's the same issue. There's no words exchanged about wanting collateral. He puts up the field as collateral. I mean, in your example, it's the same in both instances. It's not a condition of the loan. He volunteers and nobody says anything. He puts it up in the beginning. He puts it up in the middle. What Rav Huna is saying, in the beginning, it's an exchange dollar for dollar and you don't have a right. And in the middle, you can only take the $100. It makes no sense to me that it's not the same at either time. Why do you conclude at that point that the collateral is an actual dollar for dollar exchange, if in the beginning, and not an actual dollar for dollar exchange in the middle? It makes no sense.
Okay, so what's what's the reasoning behind Rav Huna, right? What's the reason behind Rav Huna? So I believe that what Rav Huna is saying is, if I make a loan to you and you pledge and the field's worth $1,000, according to Rav Huna, the lender owns the land. It's not just a mashkin. This is Rav Huna's thinking. He owns the land. I now own a land subject to repayment within 3 years. It's not as if, oh, you still owe the land, and in 3 years we're going to figure out whether or not you're paying me or not. So Rav Huna's position is that if it's done b'shas ma'isa, in other words, at the time of the loan, the pledge is made, you conveyed a field to me. I own the field. I'm the lender. I own the field.
Well, but that's a sale. The thing is that the borrower is still using the field. The lender doesn't own it. Collateral if I don't pay. You don't know yet until the end of that term whether or not I'm going to pay or not. Right, so why do you take it right away? That makes no sense.
Okay, but before you make that statement, keep in mind that we have another issue, which we're going to talk about later, is you're right. What about the payers of that field? If the field produces payers, who is entitled to the payers? Is it the borrower or the lender? Because that's where ribbis could become an issue, as we've said before, and we've gone through this very, very thoroughly, is that what happens in the interim when we're going back and forth with the who owns it?
It's more fundamental than that, because if you know that there's a disproportionate amount of value and he doesn't have anything else to post as security and he puts the field up, it's implicit that he's not giving over that for $100. It's implicit. If it's implicit, according to Rav Huna, it's different in the beginning than in the middle. And remember, in either case, according to the example that you set, Rabbi, there's no communication about requiring collateral or necessitating
Right.
collateral.
Right.
It's all voluntary. And so to conclude at that point that you're exchanging this field for me right away, that's like a sale. What that says is I'm selling, I'm selling the field. If you pay me back, you're buying back the field.
Correct. Correct. And that's Rav Huna's theory. Rav Huna's theory is that when you and I transact a loan, and at the time of the loan, we institute all these conditions of the land, that becomes a transaction, not a just a loan. It becomes an actual transaction subject to a condition a condition afterwards. So, that's Rav Huna's theory. It's exactly his theory. Now, if you make this transaction and you don't discuss the field, then you can't later come and say, "Oh, I'm going to introduce a new factor into the deal, and it's this land, and it's worth $1,000," because that's achar hamaisa. Consideration has to be b'shas maisa. It has to be at the time. You can't say, "Here's a deal, and the consideration will be, in a month." So Rav Huna is making a distinction as to whether or not a contract of a loan has the ability to be a sale, that's what he's saying, to be a sale subject to repayment, or is it actually only a loan? And if it's only a loan, then the most you can get is equivalent collateral to the amount of the loan. That really, you hit it. That's really Rav Huna's thinking, is that in the case of an imbalanced loan, it's not a loan. It's not a loan. It's actually a purchase. I bought the land, and if I bought the land, then I'm entitled to it. You certainly have the opportunity of redeeming, but I bought the land. So that actually is Rav Huna's thinking, is that we transfer, and we've seen this before. Actually, it's not the first time that we've seen where we look at a case that looks like it's one thing, and underlying there's really something else going on. Because in this particular case, you can ask the question, why did the parties not stipulate, $100 worth of this $1,000 field as collateral? Easy to do, easy to do. Now, there's something else that we haven't talked about, which is inherent in all of this, is was there a kinyan on the land? In other words, we're taking for granted that the parties made a kinyan. If the parties didn't make a kinyan, then there's no transaction. Because remember, the kinyan has to be, in the case of land, okay, you can't push or pull or lift. So you have to see to write it out or whatever happens. But a kinyan is an integral part of every transaction. So we're assuming that there was a kinyan here to make it proper. So let's say there was. Okay, there was a kinyan here, and I bought your land. I bought your land, and I gave you $100 down, and if you repay me, you'll get your land back. Says Rav Huna, that's okay. That's okay.
But see, Rabbi, but the borrower can get a double Benny. He gets the $100 loan, and he can say, "I'm not paying you back. I'm keeping the field that's worth $1,000." So that's what's a loan is a loan, a sale is a sale. He's trying to convert a loan to a sale. It just collateral is something very different than a sale. It's collateral possession, but implicit in that is that, I mean, obviously they should write the deal down, but if we're going to be that informal, you can't say that he's entitled to get this boom, because why would he pay back the loan?
No, what do you mean why he would pay? He paid back the loan?
I'm sorry, the field is an exchange, so it's a sale at that
No,
point.
he would pay
So
back
why
the
would the
loan.
lender say, "I'm going to accept your money back"? He wouldn't accept his money back. I'll take the field because it's worth a lot more than that, and he'll walk away richer.
That's why Rav Huna says that if you made this transaction subsequent to the actual exchange of money, The maximum that the lender can get is the equivalent of his money. He can't come and swoop in and say, "Oh, you didn't pay me, I'm taking the field." That's exactly the point. Rav Huna says he's
But in the
limited.
beginning, if he does it that way, he certainly can do
In
that.
the beginning, he can because the parties are of equal measure. See, once the deal happens, then it's asymmetrical because he already has the money. This guy has no collateral. So we're saying, you know what? We want to protect the lender. We want to protect the lender because he didn't have the smarts to make the deal properly when he made the loan. So we're going to say you have the right up to the amount of the loan. But when the parties transact at the very beginning, they're shava b'shava. They're equal.
But
Everybody
according to
has.
Rav Huna, he doesn't have to take the money back. He can just say, "Don't pay me back. I'm going to keep the field." And he's got a
If he didn't
an
pay within 3 years, if he didn't pay within 3 years,
no. Even if he paid him, he can say,
no, because
"No."
the condition is that he has 3 years to pay back. The question is the land already in the deal at the time of the transaction, or does the land come into the deal subsequent to the transaction? That's where Rav Huna wants to make a distinction that if it's in the transaction, everybody in real time has the ability to negotiate and to say what they want to say. And certainly the borrower can say, I'm giving you a piece of land here but remember, we're dealing with a concept of asmachta. What is an asmachta? Asmachta is a statement made which may not be a correct statement. It may not be a balanced statement, but it's a statement made to induce him to make the loan. I would never loan you money. I know you're not reliable. I will never loan you money. But you come and you say to me, see that piece of land? I own it. And we ascertain that you own it. That land is going to be yours if I don't pay you in 3 years. So all of a sudden, the relationship between the lender and the borrower is different because before I wouldn't even consider making a loan to you. Now, because you are telling me that there is a collateral here which you're willing to pledge, now I am willing to make the loan. So the inherently the loan is because of the fact that he pledged the entire thing to him. If at the time of the loan he had said to him, I pledge a portion of my land equal to the loan, we don't know if the lender would have made that loan. We just don't know. Maybe he was eager to make the loan because he saw the potential for a windfall. But the windfall is between two parties who are on equal footing. There's no impropriety. I mean, I
but
hate
see,
to
the
say it,
difference, Rabbi, is he
you may
has
not be a good businessman. You may
but
not be a good
in
businessman.
Rav Huna's case, he has the use of the land because he's saying that the security interest is perfected in the beginning, not
Correct.
in the condition. So he
Correct.
has the use of the
The
land
use of the land.
with
Right.
payroll and everything else. So he's getting a benefit from the loan in addition to using the land. So that is making money on the loan, and that's ribis.
Yeah, but if I sell you something and you eat the produce because it's your land, it can never be ribis. Even if there is something later on which changes the circumstance of that land between you and I, at the time that we transacted, you were the full owner and you are
But
totally
see, that's
entitled to
the
the fruit.
difference. This is collateral. It's not a sale at that point in time. That's
So,
where
so
Rav
Rav,
Huna is
you're right, but
typically
Rav Huna is
over.
coming to say, no, absolutely right. But Rav Huna is being mechadesh that this collateral that you call collateral is really the sale of a property, which is why you're entitled to it. You're right, Michael. If that's his chiddush, that's why Rav Huna says there's a difference between transacting in real time or in post real time after the transaction is made, because then you're showing that you're not really selling him the property. It's a total asmachta. That means there's no way I would sell it to you. I'm doing it so you can give me the loan. But in the case of an exchange in real time, says Rav Huna, that's a sale. Again. I mean, it may not sound like
And
it's
I'll go back. I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but last week we talked about Ona. So there's Ona for wheat and grapes and all this stuff. But for land, there's also an established market price for land. And you're telling me that if it's a sale, that he's getting more for the sale than he's exchanging, and nobody cares about that.
Yeah. So in other words, yeah, even though the sale is asymmetrical and he's getting far more value for what he's giving up.
There's an established market for land. Let's say there's an established market for land, just like there is for produce.
The difference, Michael, is that in Ono, there is a party who's unaware of the market. So we're saying you can't take advantage of someone who is unaware of the market more than, let's say, what, 15%. Okay. So, but there the imbalance was that you knew the market, I didn't, or maybe we both didn't know the market, and the halacha is that after the fact we've got to make it equal for both of you. Here, there's no question about the market. Everybody, it's clear to everybody that this
Not to
property
the
is worth.
lender. He doesn't know. He's not in real estate.
No. We're talking about a case where everybody understands. In other words, this isn't an unknown case. I mean, I understand your question, but this is not an unknown case because the price of the land is certain. Everybody knows that this piece of land is $1,000, so that no one is fooling anybody. The only question is, if I borrow $1,000 against it, fine, I borrowed full value. But maybe I'm not eager to make you a loan under those circumstances, but I am eager to make you a loan if you pledge the entire field to me and don't pay me within 3 years. I'll give you $100.
But
Everybody's eyes are open. It's a fair deal, and the borrower has the opportunity to raise the point of, you know, again, maybe he's in strapped circumstances and needs the money desperately, and he's willing to even throw $1,000 field. But that's not an excuse to say that that's not a fair deal. It's, you could say, unfortunately, yeah.
well, we're going to I mean, I
Yeah.
disagree with Rav
Again,
Huna.
I get your point, but you have to understand that that's how Rav Huna is looking at it, which is why he makes the distinction between real time and not real time. Only because in real time, the transaction has completed subject to repayment. Whereas in the case of a loan where the collateral only came in later, it's no longer a sale. It's simply it's simply a loan, an asmachta, and the asmachta is you can't hold them to it. You can't hold them to it because it was now the question is he already made the loan, so why even bother pledging it? I mean, that's a different question. I'm not sure why. He wants to be in good graces with the lender, so he's saying, "Oh, by the way, I'll give you a. I'm a good guy. I'll give you a pledge." There's no reason to give him a pledge at that point because the loan is over.
Well,
So
there was, in your example, there was no reason to give him a pledge in the beginning because it
no,
wasn't
there
what he
was
wanted.
because he wasn't going to get the loan. If in real time he wasn't going to get the loan unless he made the pledge, he's behind the eight ball. He's got to give him
Yeah, but Rabbi, if as you say, everybody knows what they're getting, so the demand of the lender to the borrower is that you give me a piece of land that is worth 10 times. He knows, and he knows what he's getting if there's a default, and so that provides the potential for a gain that he shouldn't be entitled to. I mean, it's just nonsensical to me.
Yeah. Well, look, there's no question of Huna is giving us a chiddush here because why should you think that there would be a difference between the collateral in real time or not real time? I mean, the collateral in either case was as a sort of the basis of why you would make the loan. So Rav Huna, this is his chiddush. He's saying, again, you may not agree with him, but he's saying that. What happened here was more than a loan. It was actually a sale. And as a result of that, the lender owns the property. Comes 3 years, it's his property. I mean,
But Rabbi, it intimates that, the like you said, The lender would not make the loan unless I had that collateral, which
Right.
means, and they both knew what the value was of the property. So it means at that point, he knew that he was getting 10 times, in your example, the value of what the loan is. So
Right.
that is putting him in a place to benefit from a loan, which to me is ribis. But,
Okay. So, okay, again, to be clear, if the parties enter into an agreement, and we know this today because of the Heter Iska, but forget about the Heter Iska for a minute. If you and I transact, and I say to you, here's $100, and there's a cost of money. I'm not collecting the interest, but there's a fee, which is what the Heter Iska is based on. The parties can agree in advance, up front, that the value of that loan includes a fee. In this particular case,
so it's 9 times the value of the loan is the fee. Now,
yes.
in any way, shape, or form, is that under halacha, is that fair?
So there's a different question maybe as to
Ripping them off, halacha.
what's that?
Ripping them off, halacha.
Yeah. So
Ripping them off nine times.
yeah, I mean it would seem to be totally usurious because why would I do that? But the Gemara is telling us an interesting halacha here, which again may be a little difficult to swallow, but the no one's forcing him to make this loan. No one is forcing him to go to this lender and say, I need
Well, the lender is saying, I'm forcing you, if you want the loan, you're going to pay a price.
Right, but the borrower doesn't have to go to him. So, in other words, you're doing it with open eyes and open mind.
But let's say there's nobody else who has the money. You're putting the Torah goes so far to protect people. In this case, a lender who needs money. We want to influence people to loan money to people, and so we don't want to put a tirch on them. We want to induce that. So, and people in need, we need to help them, but not to make money off of them. This is the antithesis of that.
Michael, you're 100% right. I'm not going to argue on that point. You're 100% right. So, l'chayra, it seems that he is making profit off somebody else's difficulty. Again,
And Rav Huna's not worried about that.
Who's not worried about it? Why? Again, what's triggering this, and again, you can say you can argue either way, but what's triggering this is the fact that he looks at this kind of deal as a sale. Now, I understand your argument, but if you accept Rav Huna's position that he made a sale of a piece of land, and in that sale, there was an exchange of money, albeit maybe it wasn't a fair exchange because it's worth 1,000 and he paid 100. But the halacha is never going to introduce itself into commerce to say you can't make a bad deal. That's not what the halacha does. The halacha protects you from certain types of actions, but it doesn't protect you from making a bad deal.
Well, if it's
as long as the parties go in with open eyes.
He's holding him hostage, so he should
Yes.
have to pay fair value for the property if he's going to do that.
Yeah.
And not so converting a loan, which is very different than a sale because you're trying to help someone,
Yeah.
into a sale is the opposite of what the transaction is. And so is this halacha? Is Rav Huna's position halacha?
The answer is I don't know. I don't know whether or not how the Maskana is. We can take a look, but his position certainly has reglaim. I'll look into that further. I don't know what the actual halacha lemaisa is today. Is when you do that, whether or not there's concerns. But the theory behind Rav Huna, which I know you don't necessarily agree with, but the theory behind Rav Huna is that it's not really a loan; it's a sale. And therefore, if it's a sale, I can enter into a sale of a totally imbalanced equation, and the halacha can't quash it
So
because
this
you,
is a liquidity issue. You're forcing someone who
yes,
doesn't have the resources to
right.
sell at a lower value if it's a
But the
sale.
halacha won't intervene in that kind of circumstance. Now, you may argue that that's wrong, but
It is
the
wrong.
halacha will not intervene to make a better deal or more equitable deal if the parties are free to decide. And remember, there was always the opportunity for the borrower at the time he transacted the deal to say, "Here's my land, but only 10% is pledged, 20%, whatever it is, so that the lender knows he's covered, but he's not covered for 100%. He had that opportunity. Why didn't he say it?
But that's implicit in the fact that it's a loan and not a sale. It to convert a loan to a sale, as Rav Huna's doing, is totally different.
But what the borrower is doing is saying, I'm selling you this property. I have the rights of repurchase, and the right of repurchase is for X dollars. Now, he didn't say that. So his right of repurchase is for the amount of the loan. If he doesn't pay the amount of the money that was given to him, if that amount does not come back, then the purchase was already made at the outset.
But see, the concept of collateral, a security interest, is that when the term is completed and you don't pay back, then you possess. It's
Correct.
not that you have the right to it in the beginning.
And this is 100% correct. Rav Huna's chidush, what Rav Huna is distinguishing himself from what you just said, is that in the case of a loan where there's a pledge of land, that pledge of land, if it's done at the time of the loan, is a sale. And that's the departure of Rav Huna from what you just said, because you're correct. But Rav Huna is saying, I don't agree with that. Now, again, maybe the halacha is not like Rav Huna, but Rav Huna is at least presenting a theory that says that we look at this loan a little bit differently if the collateral is given at the time of the loan or not. Is that a fair thing to do? Maybe not. Rav Huna is saying it is fair, and you're arguing it's not. And again, we'll look at the halacha to see what the halacha says. But at least Rav Huna is taking the position that what looks like a loan is not necessarily a loan. And in the case where there's a collateral that's far exceeds the loan, if it's done at the time of the law, at the time of the transaction, it's a sale. I know, Michael, it's, we can go around and around. It doesn't seem right. But Rav Huna is saying that that's how we have to look at it. Now, again, we'll have to, I'll take a closer look. And again, this could be a one-off statement by Rav Huna. He's an Amora, and maybe there are other Amoraim. We don't see any Tanoim who discuss it, but maybe there are other Amoraim who will argue on Rav Huna. So Mitzvah Shem, next week we'll have an opportunity. I'll try to look at it further from the halachic standpoint. But just to understand Rav Huna's position, you're right. Rav Huna is making a change from what looks like a loan to a sale subject to redemption. And therefore, if you don't redeem it, then you bought it. Okay, I made a good deal, Michael. I bought $1,000 property for $100. Why can't I make a good deal? I can make a windfall on a good deal.
But
Yeah,
then
it's
don't call
commerce.
it a loan.
Okay, right. Okay, so not on a loan. You're right, but that's where Rav Huna says the loan becomes a sale. Okay, we understand the difference.
The words of setting up this case certainly sounded like a loan. It
Yeah,
wasn't
yes, and that's the Chiddush
the
of Rav
beginning of
Huna.
the whole
No,
story.
no, you're right, and Michael's right, but that it's all a loan. Comes Rav Huna and distinguishes that it's a loan only if it's made, the collateral is given after the actual monetary transaction. If it's made in real time, Rav Huna is machadish, and he's saying it's not a loan, it's a sale. No, but you're right. Seichel tells us it's a loan, but that's Rav Huna's chiddush is that
The
it
fact
is.
that it happened simultaneously, he's
Yeah.
changing the whole case.
But remember what I said before is that he wasn't bound to make this loan, and also he could have articulated a position more clearly
Of course.
that he didn't want the entire property to be collateral. He had all those rights. So the halacha is not going to protect him from not being a good businessman.
But that's what I can't understand. It gets into involved in everything else. Each party has the right to know what the cost of goods are, whatever they are, and they're making a deal in good faith on what they are. And in some cases, the Torah says we've got to intervene and protect the buyer and the seller. And in other cases, it says no, they're on their own. They're big boys.
Right.
They
And
know what they're
and
doing.
that's right. And that's a
Inconsistent.
nuanced condition is that in some cases we protect the buyers, but they protect the parties from themselves. And in other cases, we're going to let the open market determine what the deal should be. And if it's an imbalanced deal, but the parties agreed, what role does halacha have to say? No, we're not going to allow the deal because it's unfair. Unfair isn't halacha. Deception is halacha, or violating a principle. Ribis is going. That's a problem. But unfair between a buyer and a seller? No, the halacha isn't going to step in and say, "I want to make it fair." But to your point, Michael, we have to understand whether or not Rav Huna is the halacha. But again, you have to understand. You may not agree, and I'm sure there are others who don't agree. But that's how he looks at the deal. Right now, I don't see anybody who is arguing that point. But let's take a look and see how the halacha has evolved, and whether or not he ultimately can keep that land. So anyway, you're 100% Michael. I'm not even arguing that there is an imbalance here, but Rav Huna takes the position that it's no longer a loan; it's a sale,
But the
and we
fact
could
that it,
argue, yeah,
the
yeah.
fact that it stayed in the Gemara all these years, and
What
it
what's
hasn't been,
that?
the fact that this happened a long time ago,
Right,
this argument,
right.
everybody's been puzzled
No,
by
no,
the
no.
whole thing
But
ever since.
look,
Michael's right.
again, until I see the halacha, I'm not going to say no. But the halacha oftentimes looks at the halacha in the time of the Gemara and updates it and
Yeah,
clarifies that this is what the halacha is today. Not that we want to change halacha, but listen, halacha at the time of the Tanna Memorim is not necessarily the definitive halacha. And we say that the later in time, the greater the weight of halacha. So, when the Shulchan Aruch came, it superseded a lot of the discussions that were in the time of the Gemara,
yeah.
where they said this is the law. But again, the Chachamim of the time uh, defined that a little bit more accurately. Rav Moshe Zechatzak Levracha did that all the time because you had halachas that on the face of it would say something, and he nuanced a particular position that either softened or maybe changed a little bit what should have been, you think, the halacha, but he found a justification for doing it. That's where godless comes in. You have to have that ability to do that. But again, Michael, your point is well taken. Let's wait till next week, and Mitzvah Shem, I will take a closer look and see whether or not Rav Huna is a one-off or whether this is actually the halacha.
I nominate Michael to be on the tough questions out of best.
No, Michael is always on the cutting edge.
I know the best, and he should be on the best and as a consultant for the tough questions.
Right.
It's just, and I know we're conditioned by modern times, so
Yeah.
that makes a big deal because people were honest, but there's still an inconsistency because the Torah is trying to protect people, but they choose when and not. And in the case of
Michael.
Onoa, I think it's a lot
Yeah.
worse here than it is in the case of
It
Onoa.
se it seems random. I will agree with you that it seems random. At times they'll protect and at times they won't protect. But when you really get into it, when they protect, there really is roots to why protection is necessary. It seems on the surface it's random. Here I protect, here I don't protect, here I let the parties go, here I control the parties. But every case stands alone. And you compared it to Ono, which is a good comparison. But we're saying by Ono, it's a different circumstance because by Ono, the parties aren't equal. In other words, they're not equal in machshava, and even in knowledge. We
Well,
have
the
to
same is
protect you.
true here. You have someone who's dealing in real
No,
estate.
no, but again, okay, if you were to say that he doesn't know the value, but we're talking here about a case where everybody knows the full values, but the question is, I need the money desperately. Will you make that loan? The only way you might make the loan is if I
And
give
see,
you an
that's
Uber
even worse because
guarantee.
you're desperate.
Rabbi Jonathan's been trying to
I'm
get
He
sorry,
needs to
Jonathan.
unmute himself.
Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
Jonathan, you need to unmute yourself.
unmute. Jonathan, we can't hear you. You're muted, Jonathan. You're muted, so demute.
The mute can't hear. All right. Anyway,
Am I still muted?
no, you're good,
No,
man.
no,
All
no.
right. If I say, let's say my car worth $5,000 gets towed, okay, and I don't have any cash, and they want say $500 to get the car out of Hawk. Okay, I have some property, and I say somebody, look, my car's in Hawk. Can you give me $500 to get the car back? And my house is worth $10,000. And he says, sure, I'll put up your house as collateral. I mean, okay, I'm giving, so I give, when I pay him back the $500, I get the lien taken off my house. Now, Rav Huna is saying, no, I sold him my $10,000 house for $500. Is that how that works?
Jonathan, if at the time that you transact with the other fellow and say, I need the $500 to get my car back, and I will give you this $10,000 home as a collateral, if at that time, at that moment in time, you make an agreement, then the answer is that according to Rav Huna, you have basically sold the house to the fellow
For
Uh,
500.
and you now can redeem it. You're fully entitled to redeem it by paying him the $500. Rav Huna doesn't look at it as a loan in real
he
time.
doesn't believe in loans.
Doesn't, yeah, he's saying it's an actual sale to be undone when you repay. Not everybody holds like that. That's Rav Huna's position.
Like
So,
it used to be where the seller was, when somebody sold himself into slavery,
right.
and then his relatives could come back and redeem him.
Right.
Uh,
There was always conditions for redemption. It was not one-sided where the deal is done, I can never redeem. Even Rav Huna says that there's an opportunity to redeem. So, in other words, I'm taking a tough position, but I'm not taking an impossible position because it can be redeemed, and I have to take it. I have to take the $500, give you back the house. No question about it. Others may say, wait a minute, it was never, and again, that's only because the parties transacted this entire deal at the time that the loan was made. So
Yes.
that's Rav Huna wants to be mechadish, that there's a difference between making a transaction with open, clean hands between me and you at the time we do it, or after the fact. You lent me the money. Now we're going to figure out the terms. No, wait a minute. If the terms are going to be figured out after the loan was made, not the same situation. Not a sale, no way near a sale, and you can't look at it as a sale. You can look at it as a sale if it's done in real time, says Rav Huna, but not if it's done post facto.
I
That's really
wonder
the
if Rav
discussion.
Huna, I wonder if Rav Huna was a businessman himself. Because
That's
this sounds like a businessman taking it away from the logic that we would normally think in this case.
right,
The whole thing, he's upsetting the regular simple way of a transaction
right.
and complicates it. So
Yeah.
it's
what's
not
it?
like he didn't like loans.
But
Sounds
that's
like he
what
didn't
makes
like loans.
that's what makes Gemara so fascinating, is that you're right. Logic, and Michael's 100% right. The logic should dictate that there shouldn't be a difference.
Yeah.
But Hona is saying, wait a minute. And again, you sometimes the distinctions are a very fine line between one and the other. But so when Rav Huna makes a chiddush like this, again, other Amoraim can clearly come back and say, Rav Huna, you're not right. And we'll have to look further in the Gemara to see if there even is a
Yeah.
machlokes. I haven't seen it, but Rav Huna is making a statement which, again, it may not be halacha, but the fact of the matter is that he's positing a position which, while it's a little strained, we know from other circumstance that there are times when you make a transaction from our own Gemara that we had in the last few weeks, that it's considered a sale subject to undoing later on with the ribis question, right? But when someone transacted, and we had the question of, can he eat the money during the period of the loan? Not with a pledge. We're just talking about a loan. So the question is, this is not a new question. Rav Huna is coming in and saying that my position is that when you make a loan, you have all the terms in front of you. And if you don't articulate terms, then these are the terms. This is what it's going to be. You can always undo them by stating clearly at the time of the loan. And that's, Michael, I think where you're concerned, is that the halacha is not going to protect him if he does not, of his own, make his case. And so Rav Huna is saying, yeah, you're right. We're not going to protect him.
I got another example. I have a goat, all right, one only kid, all right, and I say, listen, I need this goat is probably worth $200 for meat, all right. So I say, I want to borrow $50 for this goat. If I give it to you as collateral, you can hold the goat. Okay, so I come back with the $50, and the guy, 2 weeks later, the guy said, this goat ate me out of house and home. I paid $25 for food for this goat.
That's it,
so
right.
You owe me another $25.
Okay, so that's a different question entirely about whether or not a person is entitled to coverage for, let's call it room and board, for feeding the animal, which he's obligated to do, by the way. He can't starve the animal and say, I'm not paying for it just because. So, but that gives rise to a different set of questions, Jonathan, which are very good questions, as to whether or not he is entitled to an offset because he had to spend money for the goat. And again, a lot of these issues can be easily resolved between the parties at the outset of the deal. They could have said, here are the terms. You get the goat. I'm borrowing $50. I'll repay you for the expense. All of this can be done clearly at the outset of the deal. And the Gemara is telling us we don't have to intervene with the parties who want to make a bad deal. You can make a bad deal and the halacha won't protect you. It's just you can't make a deal that the halacha won't allow. And sometimes the halacha, you're right, Michael, will not allow something that may or may not be considered a bad deal. But again, Rav Huna is saying a position which clearly, again, we have to see whether that's clearly the halacha, but or whether or not others argue in it. So let's hold it there. And Mirza Shem will take a look, and next week we'll pick it up. But again, all these nuances that we talk about just change the equation just a little bit, right? The case of a shchiv mara as opposed to a regular deal, as opposed to a get. I mean, each one of those has a sort of a fine line of where the halacha might or might not be the same.
So
Anyway,
what is Rav Huna's? I'm trying to understand what is Rav Huna's take. I mean, you have a transaction where somebody's putting up collateral for much more collateral for a loan than the thing.
Rav Huna's take is that it's no longer collateral, it's a sale.
Okay.
He's saying that you sold me the land. and you sold me the land for $100, which may not be fair, but that's what the parties agreed. So if the parties agreed to sell that land for $100, subject to the right of repayment,
Okay, well,
that was the condition, subject to the right of repayment. Now, the condition that I have to repay you within 3 years becomes a question of whether or not the deal Lumafreya from the very beginning was a fair I mean it was a fair deal, but the question is Lumafreya, was that condition something that I had to abide by? And if the answer is yes, and I didn't repay you, you're entitled to the land. You're entitled to the land. Whereas if you did not do this transaction, you didn't express the conditions for this transaction at the time you made the deal, you can't come back after the fact and say, "Oh, by the way, I want to introduce some conditions to the deal that we did last week." That the Gemara is saying you can't do. So therefore, under those circumstances, the lender is not entitled to the full value of the property if it's a lot more than the loan. He can only take the value of the loan from that property. That's basically Rav Huna's position. And again, we'll look further if that is the actual halacha or whether or not there have been some considerations. But all right, Yitzhak Hashem, we'll take a look.